The rain fell hard that Tuesday afternoon. Andrew was 16, walking home fast from his job at the corner store. His shoes were worn out, and water was starting to seep in. He wanted to get home quick to help his mom with dinner before she left for her night shift cleaning offices. Growing up in the tough side of town wasn't easy. Andrew learned early to keep quiet, work hard, and stay away from trouble. His mom worked morning and night shifts just to keep their little apartment. Every dollar mattered in their home. Life was a daily grind for him, school in the morning, work in the afternoon, homework at night. But Andrew never complained. He knew his mom was doing her best, and he wanted to make her proud someday. As he turned down his usual shortcut, the sound of a scream cut through the rain. Andrew stopped. The scream came again from a narrow alley between two old brick buildings. Most people in his neighborhood knew to mind their own business, but something in that scream made Andrew's heart pound. He peeked around the corner and saw a young woman backed against the wall. Two men were trying to grab her bag while she fought back. She didn't look scared. She looked angry, and she was putting up a good fight. But she was outnumbered. Andrew didn't think twice. He dropped his backpack behind a trash can and walked straight into the alley. "Hey," he shouted, trying to make his voice sound deeper than it was. "Leave her alone." The men turned, surprised to see a skinny teenager challenging them. Andrew's uncle had taught him some boxing moves years ago. He wasn't a fighter, but he knew how to stand like one. "Mind your business, kid," the taller man growled. The woman used this moment to knee one guy in the stomach. He doubled over, cursing. The other man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small knife. Andrew's mouth went dry, but he didn't back down. He grabbed an empty bottle from the ground and broke it against the wall. The sound echoed in the alley. It was just for show. He'd never actually hurt anyone, but the men didn't know that. In that moment of confusion, the woman broke free. She grabbed Andrew's arm, and together they ran. They ran through back streets, past surprised faces, under clotheslines heavy with rain-soaked laundry. They ran until the shouts behind them faded, until they were both out of breath, until they reached a busy street where people were going about their day like nothing had happened. Only then did they stop, both bending over, hands on knees, breathing hard. "Thank you," she said between breaths. "Really, thank you." Andrew nodded, still catching his breath. He looked at her properly for the first time. She was maybe a few years older than him, wearing simple jeans and a rain jacket, but something about her seemed different from the girls in his neighborhood. The way she talked, the way she held herself, it all hinted at a different kind of life. "I'm Beth," she said, extending her hand. "Andrew," he replied, suddenly aware of his soppy clothes and worn-out shoes. "Let me buy you dinner," Beth insisted. "It's the least I can do." Andrew wanted to say no. He needed to get home to help his mom. But his stomach growled loudly, betraying him, and they both laughed. They ended up at a small diner 3 blocks away. Andrew ordered a burger and fries, and Beth got the same. They talked for almost 2 hours. She told him she was a student, studying business. He told her about his dreams of becoming an engineer someday. They laughed about silly things and talked about serious ones too. When it was time to leave, Beth wrote her number on a napkin. "Call me sometime," she said. "Maybe we can hang out again, preferably without the danger part." Andrew smiled and tucked the napkin carefully in his pocket. What he didn't know was that Beth's full name was Elizabeth Montgomery, granddaughter of William Montgomery, who owned half the businesses in the city. And that napkin with her number would change his life forever. 3 days passed before Andrew finally called the number Beth had given him. His friends would have called right away, but Andrew was cautious by nature. When she picked up and recognized his voice, the excitement in her "Hey, it's you," made him smile despite himself. They met at a small park the following Saturday. Andrew had just finished his morning shift and changed into his cleanest t-shirt. Beth was already waiting, sitting on a bench, reading a book. She wore simple clothes, jeans and a plain blue sweater, but somehow still looked like she belonged in a magazine. "I brought sandwiches," she said, lifting a paper bag. "Nothing fancy, just thought you might be hungry." They sat and ate, watching kids play soccer on the patchy grass field. Their conversation flowed easily, jumping from favorite movies to school subjects to weird dreams they'd had. Beth never talked about her family much, just saying they were in business when Andrew asked. He figured she was just another college student, maybe with a scholarship like he hoped to get someday. Over the next few weeks, they developed an unlikely friendship. They met at coffee shops where they'd split one muffin between them, or free community concerts in the park, or the public library where Beth helped Andrew with his math homework. She was smart, really smart, and explained things in ways that made sense. "You've got a good brain," she told him once. "You just need someone to show you the shortcuts." What Andrew didn't tell Beth was how things at home were getting harder. His mom had started coughing badly a month ago. At first, they thought it was just a cold, but it got worse. The clinic doctor said she needed special medicine and tests, but their insurance barely covered any of it. Andrew took on more hours at the store. He started helping the janitor at his school for extra cash. He was exhausted all the time, sometimes falling asleep during classes. His grades began to slip. One evening, he and Beth were supposed to meet at their usual coffee shop. Andrew showed up 40 minutes late, dark circles under his eyes. He'd almost fallen asleep on the bus. "What's going on with you?" Beth asked, real concern in her eyes. "And don't say nothing. I know something's wrong." Maybe it was exhaustion breaking down his walls, but Andrew told her everything. His mom's illness, the mounting medical bills, his extra jobs, his fear of what would happen if things didn't get better. Beth listened quietly, her eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, she reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Let me help," she said simply. Andrew pulled his hand away. "I'm not telling you this for money." "I know that," Beth said, "but friends help each other. At least let me tutor you so your grades don't suffer. You'll need scholarships for college." Reluctantly, Andrew agreed to the tutoring. They met 3 times a week now. Beth was patient but pushed him hard. "You're too smart to fail," she'd say whenever he got frustrated. Slowly, his grades improved again. What Andrew didn't know was that Beth was doing much more than tutoring. After hearing about his mother's condition, she had quietly contacted the hospital. Using her family's connections, she arranged for Mrs. Wilson to be enrolled in a special patient program that covered most of her treatments. The hospital administrator simply told Andrew's mother that she qualified for assistance based on her situation. Beth never mentioned this to Andrew. She knew his pride would make him refuse such help if he knew it came from her. Instead, she watched with quiet satisfaction as some of the worry lines disappeared from his face when he told her the hospital had reduced their bills. They continued meeting at parks, libraries, and coffee shops, 2 young people from completely different worlds finding common ground. Beth found in Andrew something she rarely experienced, someone who saw her as just herself, not as a Montgomery. And for Andrew, Beth was becoming someone he couldn't imagine his life without, though he'd never admit that to anyone, especially himself. The truth came out on a warm Sunday evening, nearly 3 months after they first met. Andrew and Beth had spent the afternoon at a free community concert in the park. Beth seemed more relaxed than usual, laughing at Andrew's jokes and telling stories about her childhood, though still carefully avoiding details about her family. As the sun began to set, Andrew offered to walk Beth to her car, which she always parked several blocks away. They strolled side by side, still talking about the band they just heard. "You know what I like about you, Andrew?" Beth said suddenly. "You're real. No hidden agenda, no fake smile. Just real." Andrew felt his face grow warm. He was about to respond when a sleek black SUV with tinted windows pulled up sharply beside them. Before either could react, 2 men in dark suits stepped out. A third man rolled down the back window, his face stern. "Ms. Montgomery, we've been looking everywhere for you. Your grandfather is waiting." Andrew froze. "Montgomery?" "Like the Montgomerys who own half the city." One of the suited men stepped between Andrew and Beth. "Step back from Ms. Montgomery," he said firmly, placing a hand on Andrew's chest and pushing him backward. "Don't you touch him." Beth's voice cut through the air like a whip. Andrew had never heard her sound like that before, commanding, almost regal. "He's my friend Thomas." "My friend." He man named Thomas immediately backed off, though his eyes remained suspicious. "I apologize, Miss Montgomery. Your grandfather was concerned when you missed the family dinner. He sent us to find you." The awkward silence that followed felt endless to Andrew. Beth's eyes met his, filled with something like desperation. "Give us a minute," she told the men, who nodded and stepped back to the SUV, though they kept watching. "Your name is Montgomery," Andrew finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. Beth took a deep breath. "Elizabeth Montgomery. My grandfather is William Montgomery." The name hit Andrew like a physical blow. William Montgomery owned Montgomery Media Network, Montgomery Industries, Montgomery Plaza downtown. The man was a billionaire whose face appeared on business magazines. This whole time, Andrew started, then stopped, trying to process what this meant. Was this some kind of joke to you? Hanging out with the poor kid from the bad side of town? No. Andrew, please. Beth reached for his arm, but he stepped back. It wasn't like that at all. I was studying at the community college because grandfather insisted I needed real-world experience before joining the family business. I was supposed to learn how regular people live. Regular people, Andrew repeated, the words tasting bitter. So I was what? Your research project? Your field trip to see how the other half lives? That's not fair. Beth's eyes flashed with hurt. You know me, the real me. Do I? Because I thought your name was just Beth. I thought you were just a college student. I thought, he shook his head. I don't even know what I thought anymore. One of the men called from the SUV, "Ms. Montgomery, your grandfather is calling again." Beth looked torn. "Andrew, please, let me explain everything properly. Call me tomorrow." Andrew just stared at her, seeing for the first time the expensive watch partially hidden under her sleeve, the supple quality of her simple clothes. How had he missed the signs? "I have to go to work tomorrow," he said flatly. "Some of us have to work for a living." He turned and walked away, ignoring Beth calling his name. His mind raced with questions and doubts. Was her help with his schoolwork just pity? Was everything about their friendship a lie? The hospital reducing his mother's medical bills, was that Beth's doing too? The more he thought about it, the more fool he felt. And Montgomery. He'd been hanging out with a Montgomery, thinking they could be friends, maybe even. Andrew shook his head, quickening his pace as if he could outrun the thoughts. For the next 2 weeks, he ignored Beth's calls and texts. He took different routes home from work, avoided their usual meeting spots, and threw himself into his jobs and schoolwork. But at night, he couldn't stop the questions. What if she really did care? What if their friendship had been real? And even if it was, what could possibly come of a friendship between a boy from his neighborhood and a Montgomery Heiress? Life has a funny way of getting worse exactly when you think it can't. 2 weeks after Andrew walked away from Beth, his mom's cough turned into something scarier. She couldn't get out of bed one morning, her breathing shallow and her forehead burning hot. Andrew called in sick to both his jobs and took her to the emergency room. The doctor said pneumonia. They admitted her right away. "She needs to stay for several days," the doctor told Andrew. "Her immune system is weak from the ongoing illness." Andrew nodded, trying to look like an adult who could handle this, not a scared teenager. "Will our insurance cover it?" The doctor's hesitation told him everything. That same afternoon, Andrew got another blow. His phone rang while he was sitting beside his mom's hospital bed. It was their landlord. "The building's been sold," the man said without greeting. "New owners want to turn it into fancy apartments. Everyone's got 45 days to clear out." Andrew hung up and put his head in his hands. Where would they go? How would he pay for his mom's treatment? How could everything fall apart so fast? He spent that night in a plastic chair by his mom's bed, applying for any job he could find on his cracked phone screen. In the morning, he went straight from the hospital to school, then to a job interview at a warehouse across town. The manager hired him on the spot for the overnight security shift. "Not gonna lie, kid, it's rough here sometimes," the manager said. "Had 3 break-ins last month. But you look strong enough, and we're desperate." Andrew took the job. He didn't mention that he was only 16. The pay was better than his other jobs combined, which he'd have to quit anyway. His new hours would be 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 6 nights a week. For the next 2 weeks, Andrew barely slept. He'd visit his mom in the morning after his shift, go to school when he could stay awake, visit mom again, sleep for maybe 3 hours, then head to the warehouse. His grades plummeted. Dark circles formed under his eyes. He lost weight he couldn't afford to lose. His mom improved slowly, but the hospital bills piled up. The social worker told him about payment plans, but even the minimum payments seemed impossible. Meanwhile, he had exactly 31 days left to find a new place to live. On his 10th night at the warehouse, Andrew was making his rounds when he heard voices near the loading dock. He radioed his supervisor, Dante, as they were supposed to do. "Just check it out," Dante replied. "Probably nothing. I'm busy on the other side." Andrew walked cautiously toward the noise, flashlight in hand. He turned a corner and found 3 men prying open a side door. One held a crowbar, another a backpack, the third kept lookout. The lookout spotted Andrew and shouted. Before Andrew could run, the man with the crowbar charged at him. Andrew remembered his uncle's lessons: stay calm, use their momentum against them. He sidestepped the first man's rush, but didn't see the second man coming from his left. Something hard hit his shoulder. Pain exploded through his body. He heard Dante's voice shouting. The men ran. Andrew slumped against the wall, his hand coming away red when he touched his shoulder. Later, in yet another emergency room, a different doctor picked metal fragments from his shoulder. "You're lucky," she said. "The bullet grazed you. Didn't hit anything important." Lucky wasn't how Andrew felt. The doctor gave him painkillers and told him no heavy lifting for at least 3 weeks. When Andrew explained he needed to work, she just shook her head. "Not unless you want permanent damage. 3 weeks without pay. An injured shoulder. A sick mother. No home soon." As Andrew sat in the emergency room at 3 a.m., staring at his bandaged shoulder, he felt completely alone. When the nurse asked for emergency contacts for his paperwork, Andrew almost laughed. Who could he call? Then he remembered, months ago, he put a name down on a school form. The only person besides his mom he'd ever trusted enough. "Beth," he whispered. "Her name is Beth." The nurse nodded and left with his form. Andrew closed his eyes, exhaustion finally winning. He didn't know that across town, a phone was ringing in a penthouse apartment, and that call would change everything. Andrew woke to the sound of hushed voices. His eyelids felt heavy, but he forced them open. Sunlight streamed through unfamiliar curtains. This wasn't the hospital room. The bed was too comfortable, the sheets too soft. As his vision cleared, he saw Beth sitting in a chair beside him, talking quietly with a gray-haired man in an expensive suit. Andrew tried to sit up, but pain shot through his shoulder. "Easy," Beth said, immediately moving to help him. "The doctor said you need to rest." "Where am I?" Andrew asked, his throat dry. "My grandfather's guest house," Beth replied, offering him water. "The hospital released you last night. You've been asleep for almost 15 hours. The gray-haired man stepped forward. Even if Andrew hadn't seen his face on TV and billboards, he would have known who he was. William Montgomery had the same eyes as Beth, sharp, intelligent, seeing everything. "So you're the young man my granddaughter won't stop talking about," the old man said, studying Andrew carefully. "Feeling better?" Andrew nodded stiffly, suddenly aware of his faded T-shirt and bandaged shoulder. He felt completely out of place in this room that was probably bigger than his entire apartment. "My mum," he started. "Is being well cared for," Beth assured him. "I've arranged for her to be transferred to Montgomery Memorial Hospital. The best pulmonologist in the state is treating her." Andrew looked between Beth and her grandfather, confusion and pride battling inside him. "I can't pay for that." "We'll discuss that later," William Montgomery said, his tone making it clear the subject was closed for now. "Elizabeth tells me you're quite intelligent, top of your class until recently." Andrew felt his face grow hot. "I've been busy." "Yes, working 3 jobs, I understand, while maintaining a 3.8 GPA until this month. Impressive." Andrew couldn't figure out if he was being mocked or praised. He glanced at Beth, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Tell me, young man," Mr. Montgomery continued, "what do you plan to do after high school?" "Engineering," Andrew answered honestly. "If I can get scholarships." The old man nodded thoughtfully. "And if money were no object? Still engineering?" "Yes, sir. I want to build things that last." Something changed in the old man's expression, a slight softening around the eyes, perhaps recognition. He sat in the chair Beth had vacated. "I started with nothing," he said quietly. "My father was a janitor." "Did Beth tell you that?" Andrew shook his head, surprised. "The Montgomery Empire isn't as old as people think. I built it from scratch. Nobody gave me anything." He leaned forward. But someone did give me a chance. One person who saw potential in me when others didn't. The room fell silent. Andrew waited, sensing there was more. "I'd like to make you an offer," Mr. Montgomery finally said. "A full scholarship to any university you choose, complete medical coverage for your mother, an apartment in one of my buildings until you finish your education." Andrew's mind reeled. This couldn't be real. "In exchange," Mr. Montgomery continued, "you'll work for Montgomery Industries during your school breaks. Learn the business from the ground up. If you prove yourself, and only if, there might be a place for you after graduation." It sounded too good to be true. Andrew looked at Beth, who seemed as surprised as he was. "Why would you do this for me?" Andrew asked suspiciously. "You don't even know me." "I know my granddaughter trusts you," the old man replied. "And I know your type. Hungry, hardworking, not afraid to get your hands dirty." He gestured to Andrew's injured shoulder. "And apparently willing to put yourself in harm's way to protect others." Andrew fell silent, considering. Everything in him wanted to refuse, to say he didn't need charity, that he could make it on his own. But his mother's face flashed in his mind. Her treatments, their lost apartment, his derailed education. "This isn't charity," Mr. Montgomery said, as if reading his thoughts. "This is investment. I expect return. Hard work. Excellence. Nothing less." Andrew looked at Beth again. Her eyes were hopeful but concerned. "It's your choice, Andrew," she said softly. "But please don't say no just because of your pride, or because you're still mad at me." Andrew took a deep breath. His whole life could change with one word. "When do I start?" he finally asked. Mr. Montgomery actually smiled, a small, tight smile, but genuine. "You already have," he said, standing and extending his hand. "Welcome to Montgomery Industries." As they shook hands, Andrew didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified. But for the first time in weeks, he felt something he'd almost forgotten: hope. The first day Andrew walked into Montgomery Industries, he wore the only suit he owned, bought secondhand for his uncle's wedding 3 years ago. It was slightly too small now, the sleeves ending above his wrists, but he polished his shoes until they shined and knotted his tie perfectly. He was determined to show he belonged there, even if he didn't feel like it. The security guard at the front desk looked surprised when Andrew gave his name. "You're the new intern Mr. Montgomery personally selected?" the man asked, eyebrows raised. Andrew just nodded, used to people underestimating him. 4 years passed like a whirlwind. College was harder than Andrew had expected, but he thrived on the challenge. He double-majored in business and engineering, studying late into the night, determined to prove William Montgomery's faith in him wasn't misplaced. His mother recovered in their new apartment, a modest but comfortable 2-bedroom in a safe neighborhood. Once she regained her strength, she started cooking meals for neighbors who worked late. Word spread about her delicious food, and soon she was running a small catering business from their kitchen. By Andrew's 3rd year of college, she had 3 employees and a proper commercial kitchen space. "Look at us now," she said one evening, her eyes shining as they sat in their living room. "My son the college man, and me with my own business." She squeezed his hand. "I'm so proud of you, baby." Andrew's internships at Montgomery Industries taught him more than any classroom could. Mr. Montgomery placed him in different departments each summer, starting in the mailroom, then maintenance, then customer service, and finally management. Andrew's hands-on experience from his earlier jobs gave him insights that surprised the executives. "These shipping costs are too high," he told the logistics team during his 3rd summer. "The drivers waste time taking this route because of traffic. In my neighborhood, all the local delivery guys use these back streets instead." The change he suggested saved the company thousands each month. Beth remained a constant in his life, though their relationship evolved in ways neither expected. They weren't just friends anymore, but they weren't exactly dating either. They existed in some undefined space between, both afraid to push for more. During Andrew's final year of college, he created a new inventory tracking system for Montgomery Industries that cut waste by 15%. William Montgomery personally came to see the presentation. "Where did you get this idea?" the old man asked afterward. "From the corner store where I used to work," Andrew explained. "Mr. Lee tracked everything on paper, but he never ran out or ordered too much. I just digitized his system and scaled it up." Mr. Montgomery nodded thoughtfully. You see value where others don't. That's rare. 2 weeks before graduation, Andrew received a letter offering him a position as junior executive at Montgomery Industries, not in engineering as he'd expected, but in innovation and development. The salary made his eyes widen. Did you do this? He asked Beth when she picked him up for dinner that night. She shook her head. Grandfather doesn't do favors even for me. You earned this. Together, they created a foundation using some of Beth's trust fund and part of Andrew's new salary. They called it Bridge the Gap, providing educational opportunities and healthcare for kids from Andrew's old neighborhood. The work brought them closer, their different backgrounds becoming a strength rather than a divide. We see both sides, Beth said once as they left a foundation meeting. That's our superpower. By the time Andrew turned 25, he had 3 patents with his name on them and a team of 30 people working under him. His mother's catering business had grown into a successful enterprise with 2 locations. Sometimes he drove through his old neighborhood, marveling at how far he'd come. But the greatest transformation wasn't in his bank account or job title. It was in how he saw himself, no longer defined by where he came from, but by what he could create, and in how others saw him, not as the poor kid from the rough side of town, but as the innovative young executive whose ideas were changing the company. He still kept his first paycheck stub in his wallet, though, just to remember. 7 years after that rainy day when Andrew first saved Beth from trouble, they stood together on a makeshift stage in his old neighborhood. Behind them rose a brand new building with a large sign, Wilson Montgomery Community Center. The crowd in front of them included faces from both their worlds, corporate executives in suits mingling with local residents, children running around excitedly, reporters snapping photos. Andrew's mom had organized the food, her catering company now one of the most sought after in the city. She moved through the crowd in a stylish dress, directing her staff with the confidence of someone who had built something from nothing. Ready? Beth whispered, squeezing Andrew's hand before stepping up to the microphone. Thank you all for coming today, she began. 7 years ago, this empty lot was just another forgotten space in this neighborhood. Today, it's the beginning of something new. Andrew watched her speak, still sometimes amazed by how their lives had intertwined. The community center had been his idea, but Beth had helped make it happen. It would provide free healthcare, job training, after-school programs, and housing assistance to the neighborhood that had shaked him. When it was his turn to speak, Andrew felt a lump in his throat. He spotted his old boss from the grocery store, his high school math teacher, even some of the kids he'd grown up with. I was born 3 blocks from where we're standing, he began. My mom and I struggled here. We didn't always have enough. But this neighborhood taught me how to work hard, how to solve problems with what I had, and how to keep going when things got tough. He paused, looking at the faces watching him. 7 years ago, I made a split-second decision to help someone in trouble. I didn't know that moment would change everything. Not just for me, but eventually for all of us standing here. In the front row, William Montgomery sat in a chair, now 83 years old but still sharp-eyed. He nodded slightly at Andrew, a rare sign of approval. Success isn't about how far you go, Andrew continued. It's about how many people you bring with you. This center isn't charity. It's investment in our community, in our children, in our future. After the speeches and the ribbon cutting, Andrew and Beth walked through the building, showing William the healthcare clinic, the computer lab, the job training rooms. The old man moved slowly with his cane, taking everything in. You've done well, he finally said to Andrew. Better than I expected, honestly. Andrew smiled. Thank you, sir. The board wants to make you Chief Innovation Officer next month, William added casually. I told them I approve. Beth gasped beside him. At 35, Andrew would be the youngest C-level executive in company history. Later, as the celebration continued outside, Andrew found a quiet moment alone with Beth on the rooftop garden of the center. The sun was setting over the city, painting everything gold. Did you ever imagine this? He asked, gesturing at the view that included both the neighborhood he grew up in and the downtown skyline where he now worked. Beth shook her head. Not even close. They had finally moved beyond the undefined space between friendship and something more. 2 years ago, after dancing around their feelings for too long, they had admitted what everyone else already knew. Their wedding was planned for the fall. You know what I think about sometimes? Andrew said. What if it had rained a different way that day? What if I'd taken another route home? What if those guys hadn't tried to rob you? Or what if you'd just kept walking like most people would have? Beth added. Andrew nodded. All these little chances that had to line up perfectly. They fell silent, watching the neighborhood children playing in the new playground below. One small boy was showing a girl how to swing higher, patiently pushing her until she got the rhythm right. Life's funny that way, Beth said finally. The biggest changes often start with the smallest choices. Andrew took her hand, feeling the simple engagement ring he'd insisted on buying himself. I'm glad I made the right one. As the sky darkened, lights came on in the community center, a bright spot in the neighborhood, just as Andrew had imagined. Not an ending, but a beginning. Not just one story, but the start of many new ones.